My guest today, Dr. Ron Paul, was a three-time U.S. presidential candidate, running as a Republican in 2008 and 2012, after representing the Libertarian Party in the 1988 presidential campaign. As a member of the House of Representatives on and off from 1976 until his retirement in 2013, he gained the nickname Dr. No for his policy of never voting for legislation unless the proposed measure was expressly authorized by the U.S. Constitution. He was the first representative in U.S. history to serve in the Senate alongside their son or daughter, serving with his son, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, who recently ran against U.S. President Donald Trump for the Republican Party leadership. As a doctor, Ron Paul delivered over 4,000 babies and served as a flight surgeon in the United States Air Force in the 1960s. He's one of the most consistent politicians in American history, and a key face of the libertarian ideology and a champion of personal liberty, limited government, and adherence to the Constitution. He's the author of many books and founder of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Dr. Paul joins me by telephone from Texas. All right, Dr. Paul, are you there?
I am here. Nice to be with you.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you today, I must say. The world just watched a very controversial election that came down to a huge number of Americans voting for who they saw as often the lesser of two evils. Now, having run for president three times yourself, including as a libertarian in 1988, you'd know as well as anyone the challenges of a third-party candidate. My question here is, can a third party, not a Republican, not a Democrat, win the presidency? And do you think we'll ever see it?
Not likely. Maybe someday when the chaos gets much worse. But the two-party system is ingrained. It's taught to everyone from the first grade on up that this is just a wonderful, wonderful system where there's two parties and not too much chaos with a lot of different parties. But the big problem there is that both parties, when you really dissect it out and look at what they believe in, their beliefs are very similar. They do have different arguments, and you do come up with a Donald Trump in the Republican Party, and you have a Sanders in the Democrat Party. But overall, policies generally don't change. You know, the Fed seems to be independent-minded, and nobody can curtail them. The wars continue. Our troops overseas continue. Welfareism continues. Deficit financing continues. So I don't think that we can overcome the rules that are biased. It's hard for a third-party person to get into the debate. It's hard to get the coverage. You don't get the coverage by the ordinary media. If conditions really, really deteriorated, maybe the people would give up with the whole system, but that would be close to having a system of anarchy, which wouldn't be very pleasant, and the voting might become irrelevant. But no, we're not going to move in 5 or 10 years or so where the Libertarian Party or another new party is going to come about. I think the best we can hope for is somebody that has a different philosophy, like a libertarian philosophy, that it invades the other political parties. And I think it has to, for a new system and new ideas like libertarianism, would have to invade all the parties because it's the ideas that count. And right now, everybody's conditioned to believe that government management of the economy and intrusion into our liberties and policing the world, they're endorsed generally. So we have a long way to go to have the political process actually save us from ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And people around the world were really surprised by the election of Donald Trump, clearly a very, very unconventional candidate. What is it about Donald Trump that appealed to enough American voters to win him the presidency?
I think it was his willingness to call a spade from his viewpoint. A lot of people say, well, I don't agree with that, and they had complaints, but at least he would say things that nobody else could say and get away with it. So I wasn't a Trump supporter, but I sort of liked it when he put the media in their place, that sort of thing. And he was able to challenge political correctness, that the insanities going on with this cultural Marxism is just horrible. So I think it was that kind of talk that helped. And I think also this whole thing about the breakdown of the economic system and the willingness to say, well, it's just the whole problem comes from illegal immigrants and we can blame them, and what we need is protectionism because the economies aren't working right. So he tapped into a lot of the things that people are angry about, but I'm much more understand those problems and understand why they're basically economic problems and the understanding of personal liberty that we have to adjust, not just tinkering and have different management. In a way, I see that we just go back and forth on a different variety of management of our lives and the economy and our foreign policy, rather than saying, well, maybe there's something wrong, with the Federal Reserve. Maybe there's something wrong with economic planning. Maybe there's something wrong with us having troops in 140 countries.
Right.
And I don't think we can solve our problems until we recognize that it's a philosophic thing rather than just a political management problem.
Right. And you're known as a key face of the libertarian movement. How would you describe the ideology? How do you describe a libertarian?
Well, I think it's the concise belief that individuals have a right to their life. It's a natural right. It doesn't come from government, which means you can do anything you want as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. And this is hard for people to understand. You mean you can spend all your money the way you want? Yes, the libertarian would believe that. The government should be out of the way. They shouldn't try to manage our personal lives. They shouldn't think they can manage the economy. So it's personal liberty that comes, in a natural way to every individual, and that we should never be seen in groups. We shouldn't be seen as soon as we start punishing people because they belong to a group, or we reward people by affirmative actions and special privileges, then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the libertarians reject is this whole notion that governments are there to protect us from ourselves. We can't do that. Then you have to say, well, if you're following a bad religion, we got to get you out of that. And so you cannot do that. You cannot think that you can protect the person from yourself unless you live in an authoritarian society. And, of course, that's been tried for a couple thousand years, and it doesn't work.
Right. So would it be safe to say that even if we consider, for example, racism theoretically can't exist a libertarian can't really be racist because libertarians believe that people are individuals. So your color, your gender, your sexuality, all these things are irrelevant, and you are an individual, essentially, and that's what's most important. Is that right?
Yes, that is it, and it's solved by property rights and voluntarism. You get to associate with the people that you want to. The government can't come into your store and say that you have to bake cakes a certain way so that you don't offend anybody. Yes, there's some things in there that are uncomfortable. Actually, technically speaking, you're allowed to be, rude to people, but you can't hurt people, which is a big difference. It's when you think of people as belonging to a particular race or color, then you end up with a lot of trouble that we have. So I think your statement is right. I think if you're a true libertarian, you can't be a racist because we don't see people as belonging to anything. But if somebody belongs to a race and they're getting a short shrift in the courts, like our minorities do in this country for breaking drug laws,
right.
I think that's a vicious thing that goes on. So there's a lot of racism in the way our court system works, but it's the libertarian that can understand that. But what other people can't understand is, you mean you can literally pick and choose your friends and your neighbor and how you want to use your own property? We think of private property as your own home, and you're not forced to invite people in that you don't want, and you take care of yourself and you're responsible. So we don't like it's private property that we want to protect, because that's how your intellectual and your religious liberties are protected, because the government shouldn't be moving in, and that's how they should protect all the media. People in the media, that's private. You can't barge in and say, I want a fair shake. So you have to have me on your air. So property is very, very important to a libertarian.
Right. Now, you are a proponent of Austrian school economics as opposed to the more mainstream, let's say, Keynesian economic line of thinking. What are the main principles of Austrian economics that our listeners might want to learn about?
Well, it's mostly hands-off, and that you can't regulate it, with thousands and thousands of pages, because that's management of the economy, and that doesn't work. But some people say, well, that'd be total chaos. Who's going to who's going to take care of the problems? Well, there are some basic rules, but they're very generalized and very basic, sort of like the old-fashioned rules, like you can't steal, and you can't lie, and you can't kill people, you can't injure their properties, and those things have existed. And then if there's fraud, you punish it. But you don't need thousands and thousands of pages that nobody can comprehend, and this would go a long way. But really, the crux of the understanding of the economy is what I enjoyed learning about the Austrian school, because it's based on the manipulation of monetary policy by central banks, in our case, the Federal Reserve, because they fix the interest rates. Well, if you believe in freedom, you don't believe in price fixing of anything, and you don't believe in price fixing of the interest rates. But that causes a business cycle. Good old boom times. We're having boom times right now in our financial sector. But that all came about with all those tons of QEs that were created. But that will also bring havoc. But the suffering we've had worldwide is a consequence of the business cycle, and only the Austrians explain that. So there's been very, very bad economic growth around the world, and that leads to, I think that's the cause of most of the resentment. And then the problems that people face. Japan's been in the doldrums for a couple decades. We've been in the doldrums now for nearly 10 years. So it's a system that I believe if people want to try to understand it, they need to read Austrian economics, Murray Rothbard and Mises and Hayek. These individuals have explained why you have the ups and downs. It is not a natural consequence of capitalism.
Right. So we're just essentially spending beyond our means and printing money, creating money out of thin air, and using it to buy things that we truly can't afford. And then the bill comes and we can't pay it, so we just borrow more, and the cycle goes on, I suppose.
Yeah, and it encourages. There's two things: a lot of debt and a lot of malinvestment. When you get false signals from low interest rates, it leads the businessman to think, oh, there's prosperity and people are working hard and they're saving their money, so therefore I better invest in more things. So they build more and more houses or whatever, but the signal was wrong. People weren't saving, and that's how you have the bubbles. But it is the ability to print money. The other evil of all that is when politicians know that they don't have to be responsible. They don't have to, collect the taxes to pay the bills. Oh, we can have a welfare state and we can fight these wars, but we really don't have to pay for them. We'll let somebody else pay for them down the road, the next generation, or pay for in the next recession when people lose their jobs. So that's the wonderful thing about the Austrian school is I think they give a clear understanding of how that works and why it encourages governments to do some very, very harmful things to the people.
Well, I don't know. Do we have time for one more question? I know you're up against some tight time there. I don't know how tight we are.
Make it short, and I'll make my answer short.
All right, okay. I was wondering, with terrorist attacks happening in Europe and the U.S., how can we make ourselves safer? What is maybe a libertarian approach to international affairs and foreign policy?
Well, I'll tell you what, for what I've been talking about for a long time is that we ought to mind our own business. There's problems around the world, but us going in by an armed force and telling people how to run their government, even when they're at fault, our obligation is to take care of ourselves. But we have to have free trade. We have to have willingness for people to travel. We have to mingle, but we have to follow the rules of no violence and no theft and honor the contracts. So this is the way people get along. I liked it when Nixon went in and opened up the doors with China. I think it's been much better off, but here now people are trying to close the doors in China and Iran, and people don't even want us to talk to Russia and this sort of thing. That is bad. And for 50 years, just look at how we acted with Cuba, and we should have done what we just did recently, is we should be talking to people. If Khrushchev and Kennedy could talk at the height of the Cold War, when the nukes were pointed at each other, we should be able to talk to just about anybody. And the imperfections are on both sides. And we've talked to communists before when we needed to. So I don't think this idea, they're not perfect people, we can't talk to them, we should punish them, and we should sanction them. The sanctions is an act of war, and the United States uses them way too often.
Well, I know that was a complicated it was a complicated question. And I appreciate you I appreciate that you were able to squeeze in an answer for that one as well.
Okay.
And thank you so much, Dr. Paul. It's been a real pleasure and an honor to speak with you today. And thank you so much for all you do.
Thank you very much. Nice being with you, and keep on with your good work.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dr. Paul. Take care.
Bye-bye.